that you're here. Do we have first timers here with us? Holy mackerel! Look at all these first timers. Do we have any last timers? Yeah. I was afraid of that. You know, if it's not good, you're a last timer. But that's understandable. And you can be a first timer and a last timer at the same time. No harm, no foul. It'll be all right. It'll be all right. I don't know if it's because I'm older, that my eyes don't work as well, but I'm having trouble seeing my notes in this light. So what I have done is taken my phone, and it will probably drop 3 or 4 times during the class, and I apologize ahead of time for when that happens, but I'm not going to be able to read these notes. And the bad news for you is, if I can't read my notes, I take twice as long. I got several people wanting to show me their phones with the light on. John's getting his right.
Because yours is not going to last for an hour.
It has been a weird 18 months since last we met, and this pandemic has really affected us in so many different ways. Many of you who have a relationship with me know that near the beginning of the pandemic, I lost my big brother to COVID. And I don't doubt that some of you have lost relatives or friends to COVID. And I'm guessing that some of the members of this class who were meeting with us 18 months ago are no longer here. I know one in particular that gives me sadness, and that's Charles Snow. Yes, we lost Charles Snow. Just as nice a man as ever came down the pike. And he had spent a number of years in full-time ministry, and yet he came to this class and pretended to be interested. That is what I appreciated. That is what I appreciated most about Charles. And if there are others, I just regret that kind of stuff is happening. I'm excited and I'm nervous. And I'll tell you why I'm nervous, because I have never taught John before. I like John. I've studied John some, but I've never taught John. And so it's taken me 47 hours of preparation time for this lesson, which means we can meet again in 3 weeks. And I should be good to go by then. And I also wonder, you know, it's been 18 months, do I still remember how to do this? And I hope my wife would say, well, of course you do, darling. But she said, well, we'll see. For you first-timers, I make up things about Paula all the time. Okay? I'm going to tell you once, and then I'll, not going to repeat it. But there'll be a number of times when I say that the reason why this is messed up, it's because of Paula. It's never because of Paula, okay? But that's not going to keep me from saying it going forward. So, but I want you to know that. Because you who have been in the class know that I make up stuff about Paula all the time, but you first-timers go, boy, he's awfully hard on his wife. I'm just making it up as I go, okay? I want you to, not the class material, just the stuff about Paula. I'm making it up as I go. And we're doing something a little different tonight. I think I mentioned this in an email. We are actually recording this for posterity. Actually, we're doing it and plan to upload it to YouTube and send out a link to people who might want to see this class even though they didn't feel comfortable coming to the building, or for some reason have a disability that keeps them from coming to the building. So we're going to record it. We got a special microphone. We hope it's working. We got a special camera. The guy in the store said the camera would make me look better than I actually do. And so he charged me double. And I was, glad to pay it. So I just wanted you to know that that's what all of this is going on. I have a friend who comes to this class who's not real familiar with the New Testament and said he really enjoyed getting to know Luke and Paul, and he'd like to know something about this John guy. Now, I don't know if the apostle's ever been called John guy before, but I want to know something about this John guy. I hope that we learn a lot about this John guy, before we're done. John, of course, is the fourth of the gospel narratives about the life of Jesus. Why in the world do we need 4 gospels? I don't know. I wasn't in charge of writing the book. But what I do know is that each one of the authors of the 4 gospels brings a different perspective and a different type of language to his gospel. I don't know what your view of inspiration is, but mine is, I believe that the scriptures are literally God-breathed, in the sense that whatever we have in Scripture, and especially in the original documents, was exactly what God wanted to be there. But the neat thing about God is that He allows the personality, the viewpoint, and the emphasis of each one of the authors to come through. They're not all alike at all. Matthew was essentially written for a Jewish audience. And that's why, as he begins, he carries the genealogy of Jesus back to Abraham. Because if you're not a son of Abraham, you have no claim to be the Messiah. And he shows how Jesus' lineage goes back all the way to Abraham. Mark is a different kind of gospel. It's a gospel of action. We find in the Gospel of Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount, 3 chapters of teaching. Mark wouldn't waste that much space on it. He's got to keep things moving. The word you read in Mark's gospel more than any other gospel is the word immediately. Jesus says this, and then immediately he went somewhere else because he had places to go and people to see. Mark's perspective is very different from Matthew's, even though it contains some of the same materials. There's definitely overlap, but it's a different perspective. If you were here when we studied Luke, you'll know that Luke was written to
Gentiles.
Yes, anyone in particular?
Gentiles.
Yes,
Gentiles.
anyone in particular?
Theophilus.
Theophilus, thank you. God lover is what Theophilus means. But he's a Greek. And Luke has a very, very Greek perspective in the way he presents the gospel. And Jesus is the classic Son of Man in Luke's gospel. And there is so much material that appears in Matthew and Mark and Luke. You know that. And that's why they are called collectively the synoptic gospels. Synoptic. Have you heard that word before? Many of you have. Coming from the Greek word syn, which means together, and optic having to do with seeing. They see the life of Jesus together. They're not the same, but they have a lot of similarities. John's not like that. John has been called the maverick gospel because it is so different in so many different ways from the synoptic gospels. And that's one of the things that we've got to look at. One of the things you should know about John, and maybe you know this already, is that in the original language, it reads almost like an English reading primer. How many of you got to learn how to read with Dick and Jane and Sally? And do you remember who the dog and cat were? Spot and Puff. Oh, yeah. See Spot, chase Puff. See Sally, run to Dick for help. You know, that kind of thing. This is how we learned how to read stories. John is almost like that. The language is so simple and basic, and the sentence structure quite easy to read. As a matter of fact, I think I was depressed at the time, but I decided to minor in Koine Greek when I was in college. I have no other explanation. Koine Greek is different from modern Greek, but it's the kind of Greek that the New Testament was written in originally, Koine Greek. And so I had 3.5 years of Koine Greek. And guess where we started to read in the New Testament? The Gospel of John. Because it's pretty simple. Dr. Luke? Oh, goodness gracious. You can't read that stuff. And probably in the original, it was illegible. You know what I mean? The way doctors write? I knew that wasn't going to be a good one, Polly. You said that. Go ahead and use that. You said. You remember? I made that up. Okay, that's the last warning you get about the stuff I made up. But it's very difficult sentence structure and the language and the big words. He is a doctor after all. John's not interested. He uses short words and simple concepts. But even though the language is simple, the theology is profound. One of the commentators I was reading said he likes to compare the Gospel of John to a pool. It is shallow enough for a toddler to wade in it, but deep enough to drown an elephant. And that's just kind of true about John's Gospel. The language is quite simple, and in a very real sense, the ideas sometimes are simple, but there's a theology that runs through these simple language words that is just, whew, it's wonderful. And that's something I hope that we develop an appreciation for as we go through this. Now, if I don't follow my notes, I'm going to be in big trouble. Okay. How is John different besides the language? Well, first of all, John includes material that only he records. Do y'all remember the conversation that Jesus had with Nicodemus? Chapter 3, we'll get there later. By the way, did you notice that it's verses 1 through 5? At this rate, I should finish when I'm 86. That's about how long it will take. No, because most of the material is just going to be introduction. We'll look a little bit at the text. But what was I saying, Paul? It's up to you to keep track.
Nicodemus.
Pardon me?
Nicodemus.
Thank you. Nicodemus is only found in John's Gospel. And the Lord has a wonderful conversation about living water with the woman at the well in Samaria. Know that story? You wouldn't if it wasn't for John. Matthew, Mark, and Luke know nothing about that story. It's only there. 6 of the 8 miracles that John records, he doesn't record that many of them, but 6 of the 8 are unique to John. Even the biggie, which is the raising of Lazarus from the dead. John's the only one that talks about that. Why do I call that a biggie? Well, it is raised from the dead. I mean, that's big in and of itself. But in John's Gospel, it is the raising of Lazarus from the dead, which is the key element in why they decided they had to get rid of Jesus. Because of the way people were talking after he raised Lazarus from the dead. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they don't know anything about that. Washing the disciples' feet. Any of you come from a church where foot washing happened? Anybody? No foot washing. Did you? It's a tradition in some churches. It's a way, I suppose, of demonstrating humility, of demonstrating your willingness to serve one another. I just hope it's not just a symbol. But our hearts need to be hearts that are willing to, quote, wash others' feet in the sense of being willing to serve one another. John's the only one that tells that story. He's the only one who says that when the disciples got there, they saw the basin and they thought, who's washing feet tonight? Not me. And it was Jesus. The mission of the Holy Spirit is found in John's Gospel. The wonderful prayer for unity in John chapter 17 is that's the only place that's recorded. So John has a lot of material that is simply unique to him. On the other hand, there are some things that John does not include that you would think that any gospel writer would just have to include. For instance, there's no genealogy in John. He's not interested in listing the parentage of Jesus all the way back. There's no birth narrative. There's no wise men and angels in the field. And there's nothing about the birth of Jesus in John. There's no story about the temptation of Jesus. Cast yourself down from the temple, turn the stones into bread. Yeah, Matthew and Luke, but not John. He doesn't include that. There's no transfiguration. There's no institution of the Lord's Supper. This is my body, which is given for you. John doesn't talk about that at all. There's no list of the apostles. There's a lot of things that I could mention. But one of the key things that we don't find in John is parables. There are no parables in John. And yet, I want to read you something. Did I put this in your notes in Matthew? I didn't. What was wrong with Paula? I told you to include that passage. From Matthew chapter 13. Where is my light when I need it? There it is. Matthew 13, 34 and 35. Yes, I know we're studying John, but I want you to know what this says. I'm going to have to put it under my light or I'm not going to be able to read it. I think they messed up my prescription, darling. It's the only thing I can think of. It says, Jesus spoke all these things to the crowd in parables. He did not say anything to them without using a parable. And so is fulfilled what was spoken through the prophet. I will open my mouth in parables, and I will utter things hidden since the creation of the world. So Matthew says, boy, parables were big to Jesus. Now, it's this section that he only uses parables. You know that there's material in Matthew that's not parables, right? Like the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, 6, and 7. You are the loud. That's, they're not parables there. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Boy, that's straightforward stuff. All of that comes from Matthew, but in Matthew 13, in this situation, it says Jesus only spoke in parables. I want to talk a little bit about the significance of that. When preachers explain why Jesus uses parables, sometimes they say, he wanted to present things in such a way that folks could understand. He didn't want to use theological language. He would just use a simple story, and that simplified things for the crowd so that they could all understand it. Anybody heard that? Just pretend like you do and raise your... Okay, good. Now, listen now, I don't doubt that that's one of the purposes that parables play. They do simplify things. But I don't believe that's the main purpose of parables. The main purpose of parables is to give the people in the crowd, because he's speaking to the crowd when he's doing parables, is to give the people in the crowd a chance to either really understand or not understand what he's talking about. Let me give you a for instance. You remember the story that Jesus told about the shepherd who had 100 sheep? And when he counted them one evening, he only got 99. Y'all know that story? Yes. One was missing. And to the shepherd, it probably had a name. Jesus says that man went out into the hills and searched, and finally, he left the 99 to do that. He finally found the sheep. He put him on his shoulders. He brought him home to the flock. And he gathered his friends and said, rejoice, I have found my sheep. Now try to imagine a man going home from that day of listening to Jesus, and his wife says, so, how was the preacher today? Did he do any good? And the man said, he told some wacky story about the stupidest shepherd you've ever heard of. I mean, here's a guy who's got 100 sheep, and 99 of them are doing fine. Does he just stay there and go? No. He leaves the 99 and he goes out looking for the other one. Dumb as a stump, in my opinion. But another man goes home. And his wife says, so, what was the lesson today? And he says, it was absolutely amazing. I learned today that God cares for each one of us individually. When one of us is in trouble, God's heart is with that one that's lost. It was a wonderful lesson. But they heard the same story, right? But the parable and the way it's told exposes the heart and the attitude and the mindset of those who are listening. That, I believe, is the main purpose of parables. But Jesus used the parables when he was speaking to a crowd, to a large group. You just don't have large group settings in John. You've got one-on-one type things. One-on-one with Nicodemus. One-on-one with the woman at the well. Jesus doesn't use parables when he's talking one-on-one with people. Now, he may use language that is a little head-scratchy, but he explains it, but it's not parables. So we find no parables in John, and one of the main reasons is that he is talking to individuals for the most part in personal conversations. Now, this John guy. John was one of the 12 apostles. He doesn't identify himself in the book. Never identifies himself in the book. There is a phrase that is used 3 or 4 times, I think, in John's Gospel, and many of you are familiar with it. It's the disciple whom Jesus loved. The disciple whom Jesus loved. It's interesting when you read some of the commentaries and they say, you know, I just can't imagine the author describing himself that way. It sounds a little, you know. Jesus loves everybody, but I'm his favorite. Paula actually has that on her wall at home. Now, I'm not making that up. I've tried to claim that. No, she said, that's my sign. I'm his favorite. But anyway. And, you know, I understand that. But would that description fit anybody and still be okay? Don't we see the Lord as someone who loves everybody? Why would this one guy be the disciple whom Jesus loved? Who at the Last Supper reclined near the breast of Jesus? He was the disciple whom Jesus loved. And there's internal evidence and external evidence. And by external, I'm talking about the early church fathers, people like Irenaeus and Tertullian, who claimed that this gospel belonged to the Apostle John. And we're going to see some evidence. Oh, there, that one. How many did I say? 4? Okay. We're going to see some internal evidence that suggests that John is the author of this gospel. He is one of the 12. He is the disciple whom Jesus loved. I thought about using this illustration, and I thought this is probably a stupid illustration. So that's why I'm using it. How many of you remember my dear friend Jerry Perry? Jerry Perry and his wife are now living in an assisted living place in Dallas. Jerry's in a wheelchair. Every time he gets out of the wheelchair, he falls and conks his head, and it's not, you know, he's just not doing great. But from the time I met Jerry, I felt a bond with that fellow. I don't know, it wasn't just the fact that we played golf and just the fact that we both were in ministry for a long time. There was just something about his personality and my personality that we clicked. I've got a lot of friends in this group and in Frisco Lakes in general. But if I could describe Jerry, it might be he was the friend whom I loved. And all that means is that there was this close connection that I felt with Jerry. And some folks are bothered by the fact that the Lord could have a special connection with, really? That doesn't surprise me at all. We know that there were 3, Peter, James, and John, who went nearly everywhere with Jesus. But John and Jesus had this special connection. And John decides to describe it as he's the disciple whom Jesus loved. That doesn't mean Jesus didn't love them all. It just means that John is celebrating the special bond that they had together, and that would be all right. So, if you think about a disciple whom Jesus loved, you probably think of a guy that's, easygoing. I hope I don't get in trouble for that. I didn't mean anything by that. I simply meant, that he's... Okay, moving on. Here's something I want you to take notice of. In Mark's Gospel, there is a list of the 12 apostles. And as always, it begins with Simon. And Mark explained that Simon was given a nickname by Jesus, and it was Peter, or the Rock, if you like. Not the rock that we have in the movies, but a different rock. He was Peter. Simon, I'm going to call you Peter. And it goes through a bunch of different names, and it finally gets to James and John. Jesus called them Boanerges. He gave He gave them a nickname. You don't have to know that to go to heaven. You'll be glad to know. He gave them, not him, but them. They were brothers, James and John. He gave them the nickname Boanerges, which means sons of thunder. Now, some of you naively think that their father's name was Thunder. And he married a girl named Lightning. No! When scriptures refer to someone as the son of something, they're not talking about their dad, they're talking about their personality. And James and John were called sons of thunder because they had a little tendency to go off every once in a while. Boom! And you could hear the thunder roll. There are an example or two in that. By the way, John doesn't tell this story, but Luke does. He said, let me tell you about John one time. They went into a Samaritan village and said, hey, Jesus is coming. We need a place to stay. And they said, where are you going? They said, we're going to Jerusalem. And they said, then you ain't welcome here. And John goes back with James to Jesus and says, you know what let's do? Let's call down fire from heaven and burn these people to a crisp. Because I'm the disciple whom Jesus loved. You see, here's why I want us to notice that. Because, John, even people with your personality can be loved by Jesus. Do you understand?
Oh, thank you.
Yes. Even if you're a son of thunder, even if you tend to go off a little bit. Looking around, there's a few. There's a few. My wife will tell you that I'm very even-tempered.
You're right.
She throws me under the bus all the time. No, I'm not even-tempered. And sometimes I have a bad temper. I'm not bragging. I'm just telling you that's the way it seems. And then I have to go, oh, I'm sorry. But John was like that. So you can be a guy who is thunderous in his personality and still be the disciple whom Jesus loved. And I like that. And I wanted you to know that. And this, so that you don't develop an understanding of John by that one phrase that is not really accurate. You know what, Paul? I need to see something that tells me what time it is. I had actually thought that maybe this semester we would only go to 8 o'clock, but
7:31.
thank you, Paul. Every once in a while you can show me that. All right. John wrote this gospel later in life. It probably was written after Matthew and Mark and Luke, and maybe there were a number of years had passed. And here's what I believe, and I don't have time to talk about the rationale for this. You can either research it or trust me or don't care. But I think the church had changed since the early Gospels were written. Changed in what way? Well, you know how churches after a while change. I think there had developed some weird ideas in the church. Anybody belong to a church where they have weird ideas? And John deals with those a little bit from time to time. So I think that he is writing in a context of maybe 30, 40 years after the Gospels were written, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and he wants to do something again. And you know where John's purpose is, don't you? It's at the end of his Gospel. If you still haven't given up on this being about John, could you turn to the second last chapter of John, which Paula tells me is 20. Oh, and she's right. Looky there. When Luke wrote to Theophilus, he says, I'm writing this so that you can have a clearer understanding of the things you've been taught. Let's look what John, and listen to the words carefully, because I don't think he just jotted this down. I think he wanted them to know exactly where he was going with this. Verse 30. Jesus did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe. These are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Do y'all ever see a little letter in a verse and wonder why it's there? I have a little letter in mine that sends me down to the bottom of the page. And it says that some manuscripts read that you may continue to believe. Is that different? Yes, it is. The aorist tense in Greek, I like to flash my Greek every once in a while. I took 3.5 years. I should get something out of it. The aorist tense in Greek is described as a punctiliar action. It's something that happens right now. Or not right now, but one time. If it's the aorist sense, I'm writing to you that you may come to believe. In other words, you're not believers now, but I want you to come to believe. The present tense has this idea. You already believe, but I want you to continue to believe. And why is there a manuscript problem? You know what? We should have a class sometime on how we got the Bible. Oh, now I remember. That's what we were doing when the pandemic hit. And, Lord willing, we'll take it up again another time. But there are many, many manuscripts extant of the New Testament. Some full, some partial. Many of them read with an aorist tense, come to believe, and many of them read with the present tense, continue to believe. It just kind of says something about the audience that John has in mind. Is he being evangelistic in the sense of trying to convert people? Or is he being an encourager to people who already believe, but you know, maybe lagging in their faith? So John says, I'm not writing a biography. You didn't read that, but if you look, that's what he said. I'm not writing a biography. I'm not trying to include everything that Jesus did. There were a whole lot of things that he did. I didn't include them. But I chose some things. And I had a very specific purpose for choosing it, so that you can believe. I want you to believe, but not just believe anything. Not just believe this or that. Believe what? That Jesus is the Son of God. And that as a result of your belief in that, and this is important too, what is the result? That you can have life. That you can have life in his name. I came to write this because I want you folks to believe something that nobody in their right mind would believe. I use that because that's what Archie Bunker said one time on All in the Family. Did y'all ever watch All in the Family? He was arguing religion with his meathead son-in-law. And he said something about faith. And the son says, Archie, you don't even know what faith is. He said, I do too. Faith is believing what nobody else in their right mind. Thank you, Archie. But it is an audacious claim, don't you know? He didn't just say, I'm something special. He said, I'm the Son of the living God. And John said, I am going to give you evidence, things that I think can be believed, that will get you to believe or to continue to believe that Jesus is the Son of God. And that knowledge, that understanding, that insight will give you real life that nothing else will. Now, I need to give you a note to the newbies. I never know exactly how much material I'm going to be able to cover, and I'm not going to be able to cover all this material. So what will happen is that the material that's in the notes that I don't get to will be moved to the front of next week's notes. Okay? I'm telling you that right now. I think, yeah, thank you, Paula. And if Paula doesn't tell me, Paul, the way Paul keeps time is to get up and leave when I should have.
I thought since we were talking about John, you were making him the timekeeper.
Well, no, I probably should, but I'm not.
Never work.
All right. So here's what John said. I went through and selected things. And the things I selected especially will be with individuals who are faced with a decision to believe, to accept the fact that this guy is the Son of God, or to reject him. Let me just give you an overview. I knew when I got to this overview, I thought, oh, Don, you're supposed to be a lot further along with this. But the overview is very important. The first, let's just imagine we're doing interviews with these people, okay? Doing interviews. John the Baptist, who's not called the Baptist in John's Gospel. And you know why? Because there's no other John. You see, in the other Gospels, there's John the Apostle John, and then, well, this John, but he could have been John the Methodist. I don't know, but he was called the Baptist, of course, because he did a lot of baptizing. John, what was your experience in coming to believe that Jesus is the Son of God? Well, it was strange, really. I was down there at the Jordan River, and I probably wouldn't have known who this guy was. I wouldn't have known, except that God told me that the one you see the Spirit descend upon, that's the guy. That's the guy. So John said, I was down there at the Jordan, I was baptizing people left and right. I was worn to a frazzle, and here came one guy, and I thought, well, okay, I'll baptize him too. And when I did, the Spirit descended upon him in the form of a dove. And I thought, that is the guy. And his conclusion is, I have seen and I testify that this is the Son of God. Chapter 1 and verse 34. He didn't say, I see and I testify that this guy is really special, or this guy can preach like nobody else can. I testify that this man is the Son of God. John is given the opportunity to accept or reject that idea, and he accepts. And then there's Nathaniel. Anybody have any grandkids or kids named Nathaniel? It's a great name. Nathan in Greek means gift. Like Jonathan, my son, means gift of God. So Nathaniel is referred to as a gift too. And Nathaniel, come in here, I want to talk to you. Now, what happened with you? He said, well, it was really weird. My friend Philip came to me and said, you wouldn't believe this, but we have found the guy that Moses and the law spoke about, that the prophets testified about. We have found him. He's from Monkey's Elbow, Arkansas. You wouldn't believe it. Why would I say that?
Paul made you do it.
Because Nazareth was to Judea like Monkey's Elbow, Arkansas is to us. It's a little hick town that nobody cares about. Whoever came from Monkey's Elbow, well, that's what he says. In fact, he says, can any good thing come from Nazareth? Whoa! And Philip says, hey, come and see. Nathaniel goes, oh boy, I'm wasting my time. But he went with Philip. And he came to Jesus, and as he was approaching, Jesus said, hey, wow, there's a true Israelite. A man in whom there is no guile or nothing false, the NIV says. And Nathaniel is shocked. He said, excuse me, we just met. What are you doing saying that about me? And Jesus says, you know, when you were under the fig tree, before Philip ever called you, I saw you. And Nathaniel has the weirdest response to that, as soon as I can find it, in chapter 1 and verse 49, Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. Now, what in the world would bring him to come to that conclusion from a guy sitting under a fig tree? I don't know. But right now, Paula is doing extensive research. On Nathaniel under the fig tree. Now, I admit, I'm not going to be able to give you a great explanation because there are a lot of books, and none of them can give you a great explanation. But there was something of such significance, Jesus knowing about Nathaniel under the fig tree, that he just went, you're the Son of God. You're the King of Israel. That's the only explanation that he had for what happened. Peter, come in here. We want to talk to you. Peter, what was your experience? Well, I have a lot of experiences, but I guess the one that you want to hear about. It was after the feeding of the 5,000. And Jesus said to the people who he fed, you're not really here for the teaching, you're here for the food. And they all went, well, you know, maybe both. But, you know. And Peter said, then he started saying some really weird junk. And it is weird. He says, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Whoa! Whoa! And the people thought, what is that? And then John reports that as a result of things like that, there were many who left. Many who left. Food or no food, we can't handle that kind of talk. And Jesus turned to us, the disciples, and said, so, are you going to leave too? Are you going to go away just like they did? And I said, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. We believe and know that you are the Holy One of God. John is giving us a series of people who, when given evidence, have come to the conclusion that Jesus is the very Son of God. Martha. Anybody named Martha? Even if you weren't named Martha, you wouldn't tell me, right? Okay. But you know about Martha. Martha, what happened? Well, it was a sad time. Lazarus got sick, and Jesus wasn't anywhere around, and we sent word for Jesus to come because Lazarus was getting worse and worse. And Jesus didn't come. And then Lazarus died. And then Jesus showed up. And when he showed up, I said to him, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died. I know you could have helped him. I know you could have. And Jesus said, your brother will rise again. And I said, well, yeah. I mean, I know he'll rise again at the last day. Jesus said, you know, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe that? Or this, if you prefer? Okay, you believe that he'll rise at the last day. But do you believe that about me? That I am the resurrection and the life? And Martha said, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God. You see what John's going here? He tells you at the end of the book, this is what I have in mind. These people all came to this conclusion based on their experience with Jesus. There's one more. You've heard of Thomas, right? He wasn't from Monkey's Elbow. He lived just east of Kansas. Maybe it was north of Kansas City. Wherever it was, he was from Missouri. Because you don't pull the wool over his eyes. One Sunday night, the disciples were gathered together after the resurrection of Jesus, and like that, Jesus was in the room. And they all went, oh man, this is the, oh man. And Jesus left, and Thomas came in. And they just, Thomas, oh man, you picked a bad time to miss church. By the way, I used to tell my congregation you shouldn't miss on Sunday night. Jesus could come on Sunday night. And you'd be like Thomas and miss him. Well, it didn't work. But anyway, Thomas, we have seen the Lord. I'm telling you, we have seen him. And they all said it. And Thomas, being from Missouri, said, unless I see the nail prints in his hand, unless I can put my finger into the nail prints, unless I can reach into his side and feel the wound where the spear tore him in half almost, I am not about to swallow that malarkey. Malarkey comes out in the Greek. It's a rare Greek term. A week later, Sunday night church again. Thomas decided, hey, I better go to church. And sure enough, Jesus appeared to him. And he eyeballed Thomas and he said, so, you need evidence, do you? Come here. Put your finger in my hands. See the holes? By the way, his resurrection body had holes. You notice that? Need to see the evidence in my side? Come on. Feel for yourself. Do you remember what Thomas said? My Lord and my God is what he said. And that is right at the end of the 20th chapter, and it is the climax of the gospel. It's the climax. All of these people have come to the realization that this guy is not ordinary. He's not even just super ordinary. He's the very Son of God. And Thomas says, my Lord and my God. And chapter 21 is an epilogue. We'll see that when we study it in 2028. If it takes us that long to get there, I apologize if it does. My wife will tell me if I went too long on this stuff. She will. You don't have to tell her. She will already know. She will tell me. Thank you, darling. I don't know that we'll go shorter. John uses the term believe 98 times. And that's more than Matthew and Mark and Luke put together. For John, believing is essential. And not just believing anything, but believing that Jesus Christ is the very Son of God. That's what John is shooting for. He tells us so. That's his purpose. 98 times he uses the word believe. And by the way, it's never a noun. It's never a noun. It's always a verb. You remember Luke? Hey, pistis su sesu consent. Anybody remember that from Luke? Fine, you wouldn't admit it even if you did. Okay. But pistis is a noun. John never uses a noun. It's always a verb. It's always something that you do. It's something that's in action. It's nothing static. It's in action. It's a verb. 98 times John uses that, more than all of the other Gospels combined. Sadly, there were many who did not believe, or who failed to follow through on their belief. John talks about them. It's in John 12, unless Paul miswrote it. Verse 37 of chapter 12 says, even after Jesus had done all these miraculous signs in their presence, they still would not believe in him. And this was to fulfill the word of Isaiah the prophet, Lord, who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed. Can you hear the sadness in the way John writes that? Even though Jesus did these amazing things, and even though I can tell you about Peter and Nathaniel and John the Baptizer and all of these others who came to faith, there were many who did not. Notice verse 42 of that same chapter. This is interesting. Yet at the same time, many even among the leaders believed in him, but because of the Pharisees, they would not confess their faith for fear they would be put out of the synagogue. Is that the kind of belief that John wants? No. You wonder. When John says they believed in him, you wonder what he meant by that. Because surely they didn't come to the conclusion that this was the Son of God, but we'll choose the Pharisees over him. They believed something about Jesus, but they didn't come to believe what John really wanted them to believe. Now, at least I'm going to talk a little bit about the prologue. Sometime in the spring, I think, or late spring, early summer, I said, here's an assignment while you're not doing anything during the pandemic. Why don't you consider memorizing the prologue of John's Gospel, verses 1 through 18 of chapter 1. Anybody remember me sending out that? Mm-hmm. See, look at they're going, oh, no, I didn't get that email. I'm sure, if I'd seen it, I'd have probably done it, but I didn't see it.
I saw it, but I didn't do it.
Now, my friend John Dill here said, my mind doesn't work like it used to, but I'll try. And I thought, make my heart glad. Now, John, I'm not going to ask you to recite it unless you want to. He's either got a kink in his neck or he's telling me very softly, don't ever ask me that again. And one of the reasons why I suggested that is because there is a richness in this prologue. Some incredible spiritual truths that when you say them and you internalize it, I believe they make a difference in your life. I told Paula, well, if I ask other people to do it, I have to do it. So I memorized the prologue. Paula, did you get around to memorizing the prologue? I don't remember.
Half of it.
How much of it?
Well, a third.
You want to go smaller, Paula? Verses 1 and 2. She's got them down pat.
In the beginning.
Let's just talk about that a little bit. I don't think we're not going to get too far. But let me just introduce it, and then we'll drop back to the prologue, starting next week. John does not start in a time that we understand as time. John goes back to a time before there was time. Are any of you really good at understanding eternity? Isn't it a concept that kind of boggles? Before that, well, even before that, well, how far back does it go? In the beginning. Now, there are some obvious parallels in the first 5 verses of John 1 and the first chapter of Genesis chapter 1. Both of them begin with, in the beginning. So, you have God talked about as creator in Genesis chapter 1, and the creator of John 1 is Jesus. Hey. So who did do the creating, God or Jesus? And I would tell you unequivocally, yes. That's right. Yes, you nailed it. In the beginning is the Word. The Word. The Greek word, and it's okay to learn a Greek word here or there, is the word logos. You've heard that? Any of you heard that? Logos, L-O-G-O-S. I could write it here on the board, but it won't be seen by the camera. L-O-G-O-S.
Well,
Look, it does?
Mhm.
Well, Paula, what are you doing? I may not know how to spell it. It doesn't hurt to learn a little Greek. Have I told you the story about the preacher and the farmer who got into the discussion after church one day, and the farmer just couldn't seem to be convinced, and finally the preacher went to the big gun and said, "Excuse me, do you read Greek?" And he said, "I don't know, I ain't never tried." Well, you don't know whether you can read Greek. You probably never tried, but look, you can read this, logos. At least that's the anglicized version. And it is translated...
Time is 8 o'clock.
It's 8 o'clock.
Now, you should know, believe it or not, she's embarrassed now. Love this. That is not the timer for the end of the class, although it could be. It's the reminder for her eye drops. Paula, can you wait on your eye drops 10 or 15 minutes? She has 8 o'clock drops and she has 9 o'clock drops. And so we pause the TV and she go anyway. Oh, but that's
And we pause Bible study.
Yeah, sorry.
that's what that is. Jesus is the Logos. You know what? I'm going to quit. I look at that and I think, well, if I have to say that, then I'm going to have to talk about that, and I'm going to talk about that, I have to talk about that, and then Paul will leave, and you know, it's going to be a scene. And so we'll just plan to quit with Paula's eye drops.
We normally go to 8:15.
I know, we used to go to 8:15 all the time, Paula. But I don't know that I have time to do that.
Okay. It's all right.
Okay, let me tell you one thing that's in the notes, and then I'll remind you of it next week, because it's more Greek. It says that John has an interesting use of 2 similar Greek words. Do you see them? Yes. This is the Greek way it's written. It's ginomai and amy. And why am I telling you this? Because it's important. And I'll tell you why. Both of the words can be translated in the sense of something that exists. Something that exists. Ginomai carries the idea of there was a time maybe when it came into existence. Amy never has that meaning. It simply refers to existence. For instance, do you all remember in John 8 and verse 46? I'm going to quit on this. In John 8 and verse 46, well, in the previous part of the chapter, Jesus got into it with some of the religious leaders. And they were giving him a hard time. You know, I've heard you talk about Abraham. You're not anything like Abraham. You can't carry Abraham's tunic. You know, that kind of stuff. And Jesus said, listen, Abraham saw my day and was glad. Are you nuts? That's in the Greek. Are you nuts? They said. You're only so many years old. You ain't got nothing to do with Abraham. And he said, before Abraham was, I am. This word suggesting before Abraham came into being, I always have. You with me? Does that make sense? We don't differentiate in English, but Greek had a way of doing that. Before Abraham came into being, I always have been around. And that made him so popular. Okay, I'm going to quit there. I only knocked off my light one time, and I think that's good. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I'll be here all week. By the way,